This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts the show as he talks about cases that involve farm property rights and what producers can learn from other cases. K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan continues today's show discussing final irrigation for crops and what water things need to be considered when making the decision. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast wraps the show as Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, and Rylee Blomenkamp explain what records they encourage cattle producers to keep track of. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking about property rights with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, you wrote a blog article on this, and within it you have 5 different cases that talk about a different aspect of property rights. And first off, discussing family members and selling of property, and what is this case?
Well, this is a South Dakota case, and it just shows us how complicated things can get when you have farmland that's owned through various types of entities, such as a corporation, a trust, or any other type of entity that's out there. And we like to often structure operations because it brings certain benefits to it, but you got to be careful. And this case points that out. And so what we had here was about 1,000 acres of family farmland, and you had a family corporation that was involved, a living trust, and then a disputed $3.2 million sale of some of that family farmland to a third party. And what happened was one of the children didn't like that. They challenged that transaction, and he was claiming that his brother had improperly influenced their father and interfered with the family's estate plan.
What issue did you see when it came to the legality and family dynamics of that?
Well, the question was who could sue on behalf of the corporation, and that was the issue here. And he couldn't. The son that was challenging the land sale transaction because he was not an officer, a director, or a shareholder, and he was not a party and individually to the land sale contract, so he couldn't seek to rescind it. And I think that's the key point here. Being a family member or even a beneficiary of a trust doesn't necessarily give you the authority to act on behalf of a corporation or a trust or an estate or some other type of legal entity. So you got to be careful in these types of situations.
And another thing we often see in agriculture, easements. And what case involves easements when we look at property rights?
This one's out of Texas, and you're right. Easements, I'm seeing more and more questions come up with respect to easements. We're seeing them all the time across agricultural property. It seems that as technology advances, they want to use the open spaces of agriculture to use that technology, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's data centers now, whether it's pipelines. It's not just ownership of property, but we want to have a right to use your property in a certain way. So we are seeing that a lot. But in this Texas case, there had been an electric line that had crossed a ranch since 1947. So this wasn't some type of new development. And when the ranch was purchased, the purchasers knew that line was there. It was visible. And what happened was many years down the road, so fast forward decades, the electric co-op substantially upgraded that line, and they tripled the number of poles and doubled the number of wires in connection with serving new customers and a new substation that they had put in.
And what issues did that create with the original easement?
Well, you can imagine how the landowner felt about this. It kind of changes the site view of the farm, and this is much more than what it looked like when the farm was originally purchased. And even though, when he bought it, he knew there was an easement, but the court said that doesn't give the co-op unlimited authority. And the key point here was when the court said, no, this is too much of an upgrade. It goes beyond the scope of the easement and constituted a trespass. The key here is that even though you knew there was an easement there and you could see the power line back in 1947, that didn't mean that the landowner had authorized a dramatic expansion of the utilities use. And I think the key takeaway, Shelby, on this is read your easement documents carefully. And they will often say what type of expansion is allowed, what type of development is allowed. But if it says nothing, then the law will only allow for reasonable development. And so that brings up a lot of factual questions. So an easement can provide significant rights to another party, but still leave the landowner with substantial property rights that simply can't be disregarded. So it's a good teaching case. It's a good case to learn from, but read your easement documents pretty carefully.
And another case that showed the importance of reading things through, this one involving land valuation. And what issues did you see happen in Arizona?
Yeah, this one involved the valuation of agricultural land that contained permanent crops. And so the county came in and valued that ag property using the state's statutory ag income approach. But then they came back in and did a second valuation and valued the orchard trees and the vineyard vines. And they tacked on an additional $12,000 for the land that had the orchard trees on it and an additional $8,000 per acre on the land that had the vineyard vines. So it's $12,000 per acre for the orchard trees, $8,000 per acre for the vineyard vines. And the landowner said, hey, what are you doing here? You already made a valuation. You can't do a second one and add numbers on for trees and vines. And the Arizona Supreme Court agreed.
And so what issues did this create for those growers and producers?
Well, obviously, the producers here, the landowners, didn't like that tacked on valuation. The court agreed with them, as I indicated. But the court said, look, the economic contribution of the permanent crops was already reflected in the productive income of the property. So when you add a separate market value for trees and vines, you're effectively, county, applying two different valuation methods to the same ag property. And that's not allowed under Arizona law. And I think the broader issue here for ag landowners is that the valuation methodology that's used by a particular taxing authority, that can be just as important as the final number that appears on the assessment. So couple lessons here. Make sure as a farmer you understand the statutory basis for how ag land is valued in Kansas, or if you're listening from another state, in your state, and determine then whether the assessor is applying the required methodology. There are often special ag valuation rules that can apply. You want to make sure that those are being applied properly, and just don't automatically assume that every component that contributes to your farm's productivity can be separately added to the taxable value of the land. So methodology should deserve some scrutiny here. So might want to take a second look at those assessment statements.
And Roger, as we talk with you, we know that rules can often be changing. However, what case recently happened when it comes to property rights and a change of rules?
Yeah, this is an interesting case out of New Mexico, and you got about 1,300 acres of land. And about 20 years ago, a farming corporation in a town had entered into an annexation and development agreement governing development of the property. And then the farming corporation later wanted to divide the property into 5 parcels, and the town came in. Initially, their planning and zoning commission came in and initially approved the subdivision, but then changed their mind, citing concerns about water resources and other related issues. The farm challenged that, claiming, look, we relied on the earlier agreement and the development rules in effect at the time then when we invested substantial resources in planning the property. And you shouldn't be now, government, allowed to change the rules and suck that value basically away from us that we were depending upon, that we were going to derive from subdividing the property. And the case got dismissed on procedural grounds. And so they lost this case. The farm did.
Even though they lost this case, what did you find important for producers or landowners to keep in mind?
Well, even though we didn't get a substantive rule out of this case, it does highlight what I think is a pretty significant issue for farmers and ranchers, and that is long-term property investments can be affected by changes in government policy and regulation. So if you're thinking about development or subdivision or commercial uses or other major changes to your ag property, you need to carefully document government approvals that you agreed and agreements upon which you're relying, and make sure you understand that the legal nature of those government commitments and what remedies you may have could change if the government later changes its position.
And how does the idea of changes factor into the 5th case of this article?
This one's a Wyoming case. And here we had county officials that adopted some regulations, new regulations that were designed to protect an aquifer that supplied drinking water to the area. And some of those regs, for example, imposed a 35-acre minimum lot size within a designated zone. And you had affected ranchers and other landowners in that zone that challenged the regulations. And they claimed, well, that interferes with our ability to subdivide and develop our property. It's somewhat like that New Mexico case. The Wyoming Supreme Court rejected that challenge, and they said, look, counties have the broad authority to protect public health, safety, and welfare. That includes groundwater resources, and the county was acting within its rights in changing those rules. And the court also concluded, and this is a key point that often I think people misunderstand, that an expectation of being able to subdivide or develop your property in the future is not a vested property right. It's not a fixed right, one that you have and you hold and it can't be changed. And I think that's the critical distinction here. You may own land today and have substantial rights to use it in its present manner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a vested right to every potential future use of that property. So don't count on automatically being able to develop your property in the future, because that's not necessarily a guaranteed property right.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link his blog article, Property Rights on the Farm, in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing the timing of final irrigation with K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. Tina, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Tina, while we're thinking about final irrigation for our crops, what is a key point that you find really important?
When it comes to trying to schedule our last irrigation for the season, or maybe even the last couple irrigation for the season, we might be under a number of different, stipulations or restrictions. There might be water rights issues. There might be, what's left in our well. And it might just be what is left of the season depending on the crop. Because when we think about across Kansas, not just the Northwest or Southwest where we traditionally think of irrigation, but there's irrigation pockets, over in the Kansas River Valley area to the North Central down to South Central. It really does depend on how much water have you been naturally getting, what has been the precipitation for you, and what is your crop stage. Just because you see your neighbor running their pivot doesn't mean you should be. You need to consider what is left of that season for your crop, because we don't want to over irrigate, because then we're putting too much in that soil profile. Can lead to, harvest delays. I know it's been hot, so I'm not really sure how much that's going to affect things. But we also don't want to under irrigate if our crop is not as far along as we think it is.
Do you ever see any concerns with turning off that final irrigation too soon?
If we turn it off too soon, we can reduce our grain yields, mainly in the area of kernel weight. And that's going to be, corn kernels. We can think about that as sorghum, grain kernels themselves, or even down to soybean as well.
When producers do go out and look at their crops, what should they be looking for to see when should they be making that final irrigation?
So we should be taking into consideration that growth stage across our different crops, right? We think about corn as we're heading into our, beginning to dent and progression of that milk line. That water use until maturity really reduces itself, right? We think about corn, and it's really not just corn, but really most of our crops at the peak, when they're really trying to push water into that grain-filled stage. The traditional number we think about is 0.3 of an inch or 1/3 of an inch per day when water demand is at its highest. And that's corn, that's soybean, that's or milo. But as that crop is maturing, it's filling out those, the seeds, those kernels. It just doesn't need as much water. So we don't need to apply as much, or we're just leaving it in the root zone.
Do we often see final irrigation really be around the same date, or do you often see a fair amount of variability?
We should not think of our final irrigation as just a date on the calendar that we're going to stop here. The only time we should be considering that is if we are under some kind of water rights situation where we can't pull any more water after this date. That is the situation in some places, but not always, right? So really, that final irrigation should look at what is our stage of crop right now when we're looking at it, and how much more water does it need to finish. As an example, when we think about corn, if we're in R4 or dough, we traditionally think we have about 34 days, just over a month left to mature. That crop's going to need 7.5 inches to finish it. But if we're already R5, so we're at the half milk line, we're about 13 days, less than 2 weeks from finishing that corn, and it only needs 2.5 inches. So 7.5 compared to 2.5 inches, that is a number of revolutions that we could reduce. It's just truly dependent on how fast or how slow that crop has progressed. It's been hot, the crops have been stressed, and we can't always produce enough water, apply enough water when it needs it if it's not naturally coming. So the crop actually may be more progressed than we think it is. That is the importance of going and checking it. Talked a lot about corn. Let's talk about soybeans for a moment. Our soybeans are indeterminate, so we're going to have pods in various stages across that plant, let alone across the field, right? We typically look at that uppermost pod for which maturity stage it's in, and just kind of giving a breakdown of numbers. We look at a full pod, that's R4. It's about 37 days from maturity. It needs about 9 inches of water to finish it out. If we're at R6 or full seed, we're about 17 days, but we only need 3.5 inches. So it's really considering what is our crop at to see how much water we need to finish it out. Because again, just pushing water doesn't mean we're going to keep getting more yield, right? The crop is going to max out at some point. And really, we're at the stage of the year where the crop has determined its yield. So just pushing more water isn't going to increase that number.
You've mentioned checking the crops, and is that something you recommend growers do once a week, every few days, once it gets closer to that final date, or what really are you recommending?
It very much depends on that crop, right? I don't want to just go out every 3 days, right? That's not realistic, but depending on how fast that crop is maturing should really tighten up how often you're checking it, because it's not just timing that last irrigation, but you also want to be timely on your harvest, right? We want to make sure we're pulling at the right moisture level, and we're trying to limit those shatter losses, especially thinking about soybeans or those dry beans.
And we've discussed checking the crops, but is there any need for growers to check their soil?
Absolutely, like checking your soil, whether it's using a soil probe to assess the appearance and the feel, is a way to double check not just what's going on in the crop, but what's in that soil profile. Another option, a more technical option, is using soil water sensors or soil moisture sensors. Typically, we're thinking about those going in at the beginning of the year compared to now. But we can see what's going on in that soil using that feel method. If it feels damp in that top foot, we do have a whole publication on this to really set what you need to do. But there's a way of going through feeling the soil and kind of seeing based off of manageable allowable depletion or this really fancy number saying how dry we can let the soil get before the crop starts getting affected.
How would you factor in if we get a late growing season rainfall?
We need to think about any kind of water being added into that system as being like a bank account, right? We've been using a lot of season as like we are depleting or we're taking the cash out. Well, every natural precept is putting cash back in. Let's think about corn. R4, we're at that dough stage. We have about 34 days left of the season. Needs about 7.5 inches to finish out that crop. That's 0.2 or 20 hundredths per day to get through, right? Say we got an inch of rain. Well, and let's pretend we didn't have any runoff in this event, and that whole inch went into the system, right? That's about 5 days of additional water that we do not need to apply. So depending on what that precip is, depends on whether or not when that irrigation needs to be. So thinking of it as a bank account.
Tina, any other reminders for growers?
A lot of work was done in western Kansas, done by now the late Freddie Lamb. Please take a look at the e-update that Shelby will put a link to see a lot of his research that he did, looking at kind of consequences of pulling irrigation early or irrigating a little too late. I focused more on just, thinking about it as a bank account, but there has been a lot of work done in this topic area for Western Kansas.
Tina, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. I will link an e-update article on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Luke Lindberg.
Reducing our nation's agricultural trade deficit and returning to an ag trade surplus. Goals of Agriculture Department officials, such as Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Undersecretary Luke Lindberg. Now a year in his post.
The agricultural trade deficit, a staggering $50 billion number. I'm excited to say that we have cut that trade deficit in half.
The Undersecretary says this is due to a combination of factors. Starting with,
the president has done a remarkable job of going around the world and negotiating with our trading partners new access for farmers and ranchers. He's signed 10 new trade agreements into place and 9 framework agreements.
Follow-up came in the form of USDA-led ag trade missions, including several rapid response follow-up trade missions.
We went about the work of building buyer-seller relationships that folks can meet in a room, get to know each other, learn about the products, and make sales happen. And we've supported over 250 companies in the past year in conducting over 2,700 business-to-business matchmaking meetings around the world.
The Undersecretary also notes a doubling of ag trade missions over the past year. In addition, there are 2 specific aspects of focus in farm and food trade. One is value-added exports. Undersecretary Lindberg uses ethanol as an example.
This year, we are breaking a record on U.S. ethanol exports around the world. Best year ever. And I'm very optimistic that we will continue to see tremendous growth on our biofuels footprint overseas.
Then there is diversification of markets.
Really a multitude of buyers out there. And this year, we are actually setting record export sales to 7 markets around the world, meaning the best year ever for U.S. agriculture products in those markets. We want to build resiliency into our export markets. And so the more that we can sell to more buyers, the more open markets are for our producers to reach, the more opportunity they're going to have in the future and the less trade disruptions from potential buyers down the road.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. And today we're joined by Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, and their special guest, who's a Nebraska cattle producer, Rylee Blomenkamp.
Do I need to keep individual animal records? Can I keep group records? What's the minimum?
Well, I'd say the minimum is, obviously the more detail you can get, the better, right? That way you can drive down to maybe an individual animal level, but that's probably a little more than what's the minimum. I would argue at the pin level, right? Track how much feed is going into it, track maybe the ration, and then you can put the cost associated with that ration. Some of the production characteristics of that pin, the weight coming in, the weight going out, those kinds of things. So I'd say at the pin level, but if you can do more detailed, that's even better. But if the minimum, just so you know, is this pin of calves or is this enterprise of calves, is it making money? Is it losing money? And then you can try to figure out maybe why that was the case.
Yeah. So which leads into, Rylee, next question for you is, how do you use your records to make decisions? Are there specific metrics that you look at or specific things that, because I know it's not just all the profit and loss, because that comes at the end, right? I can't change any decisions at that point. But is there anything that you look at that makes you say, okay, well, I might need to do this a little bit different?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, like in our area, feed source. This year where there's not a lot of pasture and there's not a lot of grass. So then you've got to look at if you're buying, sorghum sedan hay or if you're buying alfalfa hay. If you can get distillers or if you can get beet pulp, we've got lots of beets in our area, but this year, there hasn't been a lot of beets because we haven't had any moisture. So are you going to be able to get beet pulp? So that's kind of the first, but then, you look at, okay, how are these cattle going to perform on wet distillers versus dry distillers, different things like that. So yeah, like you said, keeping records. And my husband's really good about just keeping everything in his head. He kind of knows how things will perform. He's fed cattle long enough and he kind of knows the area as far as, he was born and raised around here. So he kind of knows what feed sources are available around here. And what the cattle are like around here. So what they're going to do well and how they're going to perform based on, like you said, their nutrition is and what their feed source is going to be.
As we kind of put all this together, Bob, give me one or two things that are kind of take homes you think from this conversation.
When I look at the clients that I had that I thought really kind of had the best sustainable financial operation, they had plans, but they were also flexible. That sounds like I'm saying two different things, but these were producers that kind of knew their costs. They knew what was available locally, but they were flexible on timing of such as, timing of weaning, timing of marketing. Do I buy extra calves this year or not? Those types of things. So they had a plan, but they were also flexible. And I have a lot of respect for people that kind of can do that. And there's certainly some record keeping and some spreadsheet, and then there's some just experience.
Well, and I like the way you put it. They have a plan, but they're flexible. So you're not so rigidly tied to that plan that you follow it no matter what. It's kind of like we've talked about grazing management plans, some of the other stuff.
You might have to take cows off early this year.
Yeah, you might have to change. So Rylee, any last things you'd like us to know kind of as take-homes from your operation or what you've learned through this process of keeping more in-depth records?
No, like you were kind of saying, the biggest thing is just being flexible, especially in markets like this year. You never know what class of cattle is going to be coming to town. So just, being flexible, but then also being open to doing something different. I think that's where my husband has kind of stood out, is he's not afraid to go try something new or to buy a different class of cattle. If he sees it in the sale ring, and it's a cheaper commodity that day, he's going to buy it and, figure out how to feed it and how to put money back into that cattle, how to give that cattle value.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with their special guest, Rylee Blomenkamp, and Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell. If you would like to check out the full podcast episode, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by going to ksubci.org. That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.